Okay, now we have 6 trigonometric functions, but are they going to be positive and or negative in quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4? So let's determine each of them. In quadrant 1 consists of the positive part of the x-axis and the negative part of the y-axis. And of course, we know that cosine function is the x-coordinate of the angles cosine function is the x-coordinate of all of these angles, and the sine function is the y-coordinates of all of these angles. We know for sure that the sine and cosine angle are going to be positive. So POS, positive. We're going to have sine of theta, cosine of theta. What about tangent? Well, tangent is sine over cosine. Since sine is positive and cosine is also positive, positive over positive is going to give you positive. And theta is just a standard angle. Cosecant. Well, cosecant is positive 1 over sine, but positive 1 over a positive sine function is going to be positive. So cosecant of theta is going to be positive. What about secant? Well, secant is positive 1 over cosine, but since cosine is positive, we know secant is going to be positive as well, like that. And cotangent is also going to be positive, because cotangent is cosine over sine. Cosine is positive, sine is positive, so cotangent has to be positive as well. So we have all positive trig function, and we don't have any negative. Well, for quadrant 2, which trig function is going to be positive and which trig functions are going to be negative? Well, positive, we know one trig function that will be positive is a sine function, because the y-coordinates of all the angles in quadrant 2 are positive, and since sine function in trigonometry is the y-coordinate of the standard angles, we know sine of theta is positive. But cosine of theta is going to be negative because the x-coordinates of all the angles in quadrant 2 are negative. So tangent is sine over cosine. Since sine is positive and cosine is negative, we know tangent is going to be negative, because tangent is going to be positive over negative, which will give us negative. Cosecant is 1 over sine, but sine is positive, so positive 1 over a positive is going to be positive. Secant is 1 over cosine. Well, positive 1 over negative cosine is going to give us a negative function, so secant is negative. Cotangent. Well, cotangent is cosine over sine, but we have negative cosine over positive sine, which will give us negative cotangent. Now let's try the same thing for quadrant 3. Hopefully I have some room here. So I think you guys can see that. Which function is positive and which function is negative in quadrant 3? Well, positive, I think we are going to have some positive. Yeah, we are going to have positive tangent, because for negative function, we know sine and cosine are negative. Why? Because the y-coordinates of all the angles in quadrant 3 are negative. So that's why sine is negative. And the same thing can be said for the x-coordinates, which make cosine negative as well. Well, tangent is going to be sine over cosine. Sine and cosine are negative. We have negative over negative, which will be positive. And the same thing can be said for cotangent, because cotangent is cosine over sine. And since cosine and sine are both negative, we have negative over negative again. So cotangent is also positive. Cosecant. Well, cosecant is positive 1 over sine, but since sine is negative, we have positive 1 over negative sine, which will give us negative cosecant. Secant of theta is positive 1 over negative cosine. So secant is also negative. And quadrant 4, well, the same approach, or the same thinking, I should say. Positive trig function. So since quadrant 4 consists of the positive part of the x-axis and the negative part of the y-axis, we know that the cosine function will be positive, because remember that cosine of the standard angle theta is the x-coordinate of that standard angle. So cosine is positive, sine is negative, because again, quadrant 4 consists of the negative part of the y-axis. What about tangent? Those are the y, put sine right here. We know tangent is going to be negative because tangent is sine over cosine. Since sine is negative, cosine is positive. We have negative or positive, which is negative. And same thing for cotangent. Cotangent is cosine over sine. Since cosine is positive and sine is negative, we have positive over negative, which will give us negative. So cotangent is negative. Cosecant. Well, cosecant is 1 over sine, but since sine is negative, we have 1 over negative sine, which will give us negative cosecant. So hopefully you can see it there. Now secant. Secant is positive 1 over cosine. Since cosine is positive, we have positive 1 over positive cosine, and we will have positive secant of theta. So yeah, that is how we determine whether all the 6 trigonometric functions are positive and or negative.